backward step. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, happy to take a call on the title, commencement and clause, part 3 or clause 3 of this Television New Zealand Amendment Bill. To start with the title first, I think what we could more accurately describe this bill as is the final death knell for public television broadcasting in New Zealand bill. Because ultimately what we know now is we don't have a public television broadcaster in New Zealand. Their financial review, which I had the opportunity to flick through just the other day when it was being debated by the House, Television New Zealand actually said they don't regard themselves as a public television broadcaster and never have. In fact, their primary motivation all along has been as a commercial broadcaster. And I think what this bill does is it moves us further down that line of saying Television New Zealand is not going to be a public broadcaster. It is going to be a purely commercial organisation. And so we should actually be totally upfront about that and say we don't have in New Zealand a public television broadcaster. We would be one of the, I think, few OECD countries that doesn't have a public television service. We have a television service that is owned by the public, but that doesn't necessarily make it a public television service. In fact, Television New Zealand's almost exclusive goal now is to make money. And we can certainly see evidence of that in my electorate, which is one of the reasons why I argue that this should be the final death of public broadcasting bill. And that's because what we've seen in my electorate, which is home to the Avalon television studios for as long as they continue to exist, which based on current standing may not be very much longer. Television New Zealand's very checkered history, the Avalon studios were constructed in the 70s and 80s to be the home of New Zealand television, the home of public New Zealand television, public broadcasting in New Zealand. And one of the reasons I think that we should call this the final death of public broadcasting bill is because the Avalon TV studios are scheduled to be closed. Television New Zealand is effectively going to abandon them. It's going to abandon all of the people that work in them, and they will effectively end up being mothballed because the chances of them finding someone who is willing to buy them are relatively low. And I think that when I look at the Avalon TV studios, I kind of look at it and I think, what a waste, because that could and should be the home of public television broadcasting in New Zealand. And if we had a public television network, that would be the perfect place for them to be. It has arguably the best studio facilities, the best television studio facilities in the Southern Hemisphere. Almost everybody who has worked there or produced any television there will agree with that, and yet they are not being used. And they are not being used because Television New Zealand isn't a public broadcaster. They are more inclined to rely on cheap imported content, reality TV shows that aren't produced in a studio but are produced by giving someone a camera and telling them to follow some celebrities around for a little while. And as a result, what we see on our television in New Zealand doesn't differentiate us as a country from any other country in the world. New Zealand's identity is not reflected by Television New Zealand any more than it is reflected by TV3 or Sky TV. And so the question becomes, are they a public television network? No, I don't think they are. I don't think they are any more New Zealand than TV3 or Sky TV are. In fact, actually, another reason we should call this the final death of public broadcasting in New Zealand is now actually Television New Zealand have become a content provider for pay TV. They provide an entire channel called TVNZ Heartland, which was only available to Sky subscribers who are willing to pay for it. So how could we possibly say that Television New Zealand is a public broadcaster when one of their channels, which is made up exclusively of New Zealand content, a lot of it funded by the taxpayer through New Zealand On Air at various points, is only available to people who are willing to subscribe to Sky Television, which is one of the reasons why we should call the bill the final death of public broadcasting bill. We could call it the death of Avalon TV Studios bill, because one of the things, or the Avalon Television Complex bill, because one of the things this bill does is it makes some changes around access to the television archives. And the television archives are currently based at Avalon, beside the Avalon Television Studios, in brand new facilities that are less than 10 years old. And one of the things the government are proposing to do, in other legislation that no doubt will come before this House, is force an amalgamation between the television archive and the film archive, which will basically mean, potentially, that brand new less than 10-year-old television archive facility at Avalon, beside the Avalon TV studios, will go the same way as the Avalon studios and be mothballed by Television New Zealand when that happens. And I think that's, Mr Chair, I think that's incredibly sad, Mr Chairman.
Another call?
Another call, thank you, Mr Chairman.
Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman, so to continue to elaborate on the reason why I think the bill should be called the final death of the Avalon television complex bill, it's basically potentially we're seeing the end of Avalon, the end of the studios. The tower block's already gone. That's a commercial office block now already. The studios themselves are shortly to follow. The studios shortly, that's right. Well, actually, Charles Chevelle raises a very good point. What will happen to Esther's cooking segment on the Good Morning Show, currently produced at Avalon? All of the people, Charles Chevelle is very concerned about this having just been on the cooking segment of the Good Morning TV show. But actually, all the people that work on the Good Morning Show, all the people that work on the Good Morning Show say that they cannot produce that show in its current format in the Auckland studios. They're not big enough. So the cooking segment and the New Zealand music segment will probably have to disappear because the Auckland studios aren't big enough for them to do it in. So it's another potential name for this bill, is another kick in the guts to New Zealand music. Because actually the Good Morning TV show, rather tragically, is one of the few opportunities a lot of New Zealand musicians have to perform live on New Zealand television, and they do that on the Good Morning Show in the mornings. And if that opportunity is taken away from them when TV Auckland relocates the last of its operations to Auckland, completely abandoning the rest of the country as Television New Zealand has progressively done over the last 2 decades, that will be yet another thing that we will see the demise of. We've already seen the demise of the Goodnight Kiwi. Back in the day, the cartoon of the Goodnight Kiwi, of course, was the Goodnight Kiwi leaving the Avalon TV studios and going up the mast to be put to bed. And of course, Avalon was iconic. It was the symbol of public television broadcasting in New Zealand, and it's very sad. I find it particularly sad when you drive past there at night now and the building is completely dark. Because when I was growing up there in the hut as a kid, you'd drive past the Avalon complex, and it would be alight in the evenings, because that was where all of the New Zealand television was coming from. You always knew when Fair Go was being produced in the evening, because all the lights of the studios would be on and the car park would be full, because once upon a time Fair Go, it was the most popular show on New Zealand television. I think it probably still is. It was filmed in front of a live audience at Avalon, and I had the opportunity to sit in the audience for one of those filmings. I sat in the audience for filming for some of the game shows, Wheel of Fortune, Sale of the Century and so on. Probably not the pinnacle of public broadcasting in New Zealand, Sale of the Century, but nonetheless filmed at the Avalon TV studios in my electorate. Another one of the things that will be very difficult to produce in New Zealand when we see the demise of those large studios that currently reside in Avalon, because Television New Zealand aren't willing to back them. They aren't willing to behave as a public broadcaster as they should do. And I think that's an absolute disgrace. So we could call this bill that we don't have a public television broadcasting service in New Zealand bill, because I think ultimately that's where we've got to. We simply do not have public television broadcasting in New Zealand, and I think actually we should be really honest about it and say we probably haven't had for several decades. I don't think Television New Zealand has ever been, in its current corporate carnation, a public television broadcaster. It's never been set up that way. Right from the point where it became a state-owned enterprise, it ceased to be a public broadcaster. The almighty dollar became the most important. The studios, the head office, relocated to Auckland. Television New Zealand now is effectively Television Auckland. Everything that we see on our screens is largely produced there, very little produced in other parts of the country. I think that's an absolute tragedy. It does not reflect New Zealand, and it is no different, as I've said before, to what you'll see on TV3 or Sky TV. And actually, as we move to technology convergence, I think another reason we could call this bill the bill that's years out of date, because as we move towards technology convergence, actually the platform that the content is delivered on is a lot less important than the content itself. And Television New Zealand's future must be in producing New Zealand content that is distinctly New Zealand, because if all it is repackaging stuff that comes in from overseas, from America, from Britain, from Australia, it will have no distinctive features, no distinctive content, and there'll actually, frankly, be no need for it to exist. So Television New Zealand's future must be in telling New Zealand stories, producing New Zealand content, and it's not doing that. This bill does nothing to achieve that. In fact, it goes in the other direction, which ultimately, Mr. Chair, is the reason why I think we should call this the final death of public broadcasting in New Zealand.
Young.